Before we get started, I just wanted a couple odds and ends. Did you all get your little booklet? Okay, this is what I did in the month of May, and up at the cabin. So I'm going to pick up one part of it, which is the literal part. We talked about what it was, a little translation. And then tonight what we're going to do is, I categorize translations in 5 camps, and that's laid out in here. And that's what the panel discussion is going to be about. I'll do a presentation on, formal equivalent, dynamic, and then we'll let the panel and you all argue about pros and cons of each one, okay? So that's the schedule. Tomorrow morning, it was a little bit up in the air, but since this was advertised as the trustworthiness of the Bible, I thought, hey, let's talk about the trustworthiness of the Bible. And there's a talk that I've done that talks about why are translations different and can you trust them? So that's what we'll be doing tomorrow morning, and then have a Q&A time, stump the translator kind of time. So that's how it's scheduled out, okay? So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to, I don't know what the expression would be. I hate that word. And so I want to talk about it. So I'm going to read, because it's kind of an academic paper, I'm going to read a little bit, talk a little, and then we'll take, we can do questions while we're doing it, or you can save them up till afterwards. Do you have a preference? Okay, so we'll just kind of flow. And sorry to be up here, but we need to be up here for the audio and video. So I was wanting to get down there, but they said that wouldn't work. So, and I can see you. I couldn't see hardly anyone this morning. Yeah, I can see you fine, so fine. Well, welcome to this hour on the Bible and translation issues. And like I said, I want to talk about the word literal. Because if you ask someone on the street, ask someone next to you in church, what kind of Bible do you want? Their answer is usually, I want a literal Bible. And the problem is that's not what they think the word literal means is not what the word means. And it really assumes the conclusion, and that's the problem with the word. And when I'm done, hopefully you'll never talk about a literal Bible again. That's my goal for you all, okay? It is not the right word for translation. But let me start just a little bit of background so you know how I got into this. I was the New Testament chair of the ESV for 10 years. Actually, Dad and ESV is an evangelical update, so to speak, of the RSV. And Dad and I did all the initial suggested changes. About 80% of them went through without a vote, which is cool. So Dad and I are responsible for the vast majority of the changes in the New Testament of the ESV. The other 10 we argued about for 10 years. And so it was a good progress, a good process, a good learning process. I made some very, very good friends on the committee. And then that ended. And I went for a while, and I wasn't doing anything, and I told Robin, my wife, I said, I really miss translation. It's like a giant Bible study. And you hear people that are experts in all these different areas, and it's an amazing time. And I just wish I could get on some committee. And the next morning, an email came from Doug Moo, who's the chairman of the CBT, and asked if I would be willing to come on the CBT committee for the NIV as a, quote, friendly critic, which was a very interesting way to try to get someone to commit a large portion of their time to. Hey, come and be a critic of what we're doing. And I've never asked Doug why he termed it that way, but there are a couple of reasons, I'm sure. One is I had signed the initial protest against the TNIV. The TNIV was supposed to be the next iteration of the NIV. Its handling of gender language was, I thought, very poor. And it just caused all kinds of issues in the Bible world, and a bunch of us signed protests against it. What happened was then the discussion turned nasty. And some of the people that I had signed the protest list with started questioning motives. And I still remember George Ladd in seminary saying, never, ever, ever question motives. 1, you don't know what they are. And 2, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. All you have are the facts. All you have is the text. And so I got off that list, but that was kind of maybe partially why I was termed a friendly critic. And the other is that the ESV is a totally different translation philosophy. We're going to talk about this tonight. A translation philosophy that is, well, Crossway calls it essentially literal. It's a formal equivalent translation. And the NIV is a functional or a dynamic translation. So they're significantly different translation philosophies. And I think Doug's assumption was that I would try to pull the NIV more towards the ESV. What Doug didn't know is that on the ESV, Dad and I were the most dynamic of the translators. And so it wasn't that big of a step to move over into the NIV. But the other thing that was very interesting about the transition was because I spent so much of my life in first year Greek. And in the first year Greek, you're doing the building blocks, right? Yeah, words have lots of meanings. Just pick one and translate this word and translate in a way that I can tell that you know it's an aorist adverbial participle. All right? Didn't matter about style, whether it made any sense. That wasn't the point. The point is I need to know as a teacher that you know this is an aorist adverbial participle. It's not that big of a step to go from that to doing a functional, a formal equivalent translation because they're similar. They're similar. And so the shift over to the NIV was a very interesting shift. Coming over to a translation committee that spent an inordinate amount of time on English style. In the NIV, it's incredibly important how you hear something. And is this the way you say things now? If we translate it this way, is that how you talk? Will it impact you the same way that it impacted the original audience? So it's been a very interesting transition. In fact, it wasn't until last year that I finally started submitting suggested changes because it took me a long time to really figure out the NIV. But Doug thought I was going to be a friendly critic, and hopefully I am friendly. But that was kind of the background to it. So it was an absolute answer to prayer. And I've been on it for 6 years now. During the course of that time, my buddies on the NIV have made me question almost everything I thought about translation. It was, no matter what conclusion I had, someone on the NIV committee would have a slightly different take on it. And it's been a real learning experience. I want to say up front, I have no desire to bash the ESV. I'm not going to bash the ESV. It's a great translation. It's a different philosophy from the NIV, but that's not my purpose in doing this. I just want to show why they're so different. And in the process, talk about this horrid word we use, literal. Okay? So that's background. The first point I make in the booklet, is literally, there's no such thing as literal. It's a word that should be banned from all discussions of translation because it just doesn't fit. I have learned that the word literal should be banned from all discussions of translation. Most of the time its use assumes the conclusion. Someone will say they want a literal Bible. Well, if you heard someone say, I want a literal Bible, what would you hear? The what? You hear an adjective after the subject and all kinds of different. Okay, in other words, you would hear Greek word order, not English word order. All right? The house big black, is that translation? It is in Spanish, right? Adjectives in Spanish come after the nouns, which makes a whole lot more sense in English. But yeah, you would the house the big. That's Greek order, right? What else would you hear when you heard someone say, I want a literal Bible? Do you what? You actually want the book, all right. Yeah, I think for most of the discussions I've been in where someone says, I want a literal Bible, and I go, what do you mean by that? The answer is, I want a formal equivalent translation. That's what they're thinking. I want you just to translate the words. Don't put your words into it. Don't move things around. Don't help me understand what it says. Just give me the words. All right, that's what most people are going to mean by it. Do you know what the word literal actually means? The word literal has to do with meaning, not form. That's the key. Any dictionary you look at, and I think I've looked at all of them now, that is what they're saying. The word literal has to do with meaning, not with form, not with an adjective after the noun and this kind of stuff. Or if it's a participle in Greek, it should be a participle in English. That's form, right? But the word literal has to do with meaning. It denotes the actual factual meaning of something. Merriam-Webster says, free from exaggeration and embellishment. See, that's not a form thing, is it? That's a meaning thing. So when you want a literal Bible, if you're using the word literal properly, what you're saying is, I want one that conveys the meaning accurately. One that conveys the meaning without embellishment, without exaggeration. I mean, that's what the word literal means. In the American Heritage Dictionary, just to pick one, these are the three basic definitions it gives. Being in accordance with, conforming to, or upholding the exact or primary meaning of a word or words. See, there's nothing about form, is it? If it's a preposition in Greek, it should be a preposition in English. It's meaning. The second definition, we're going to come back to that, is word for word or verbatim. And the third is avoiding exaggeration, metaphor, or embellishment. In other words, a literal translation is one that is faithful to the meaning of the original, not the form, to the meaning of the original. When I wrote this back in May, I struggled a bit with the definition too. And I say in the book, I said, okay, it looks like literal does have a secondary meaning, never listed first, that could be used to support the use of the word literal for word. But then, after I turned the book in, I went back and I read some of it, and it was interesting the illustrations they placed under number 2. The 300,000 Unionists, whoever they are, will be literally thrown to the wolves. That was an illustration of word for word. Well, did he literally want 300,000 literal Unionists thrown to literal wolves? No, of course not. That doesn't make any sense. Another illustration they gave was 15 years of literal hell. Literally? No, it's an expression we use, right? Oh, that final was literal hell, right? So I think what's going on in number 2, as I've thought more about this, is that word for word means without embellishment. Let me give you an example. Give me a sentence with the word literal in it. Just make up something. It's always hard to do this on the spot, I know. You're all afraid of me now. I am such a nice guy. You're literally afraid of me?
Don't take whatever I say literally.
Okay, don't take what I say literally. That's a very good example. It's kind of the reverse. Don't take something literally. In other words, I don't really mean what I'm saying. See, it's meaning, isn't it? Are you literally afraid of me? No, that's not what the word literal means. If I said, I'm talking to Steve here, and there was another conversation that Steve had, and I'm kind of scratching my head about it. I say, Steve, tell me literally what he said. What did I just ask for? Word for word. Right. In other words, Steve, don't add commentary. Don't read between the lines. Just tell me what he said. Give me the words. Make it a direct quote, not an indirect quote. See, the point is, it's all meaning. See, I don't want him to add meaning to it. I just want to know what the word for words were so I can understand the meaning. So I don't even think, I've changed my position a bit on this, I don't even think that definition number 2 can be used to discuss translations. And I don't even think you can use it in multi-language translation. I think it just doesn't fit. The fact of the matter is, no translation is word for word. Not a single verse in a single I have not read Young's literal translation, so I put that caveat. But my experience is that there's not a single verse in a single translation that actually is word for word. Are you aware of that? Greek word order and Greek grammar and the meaning of Greek words are so fundamentally different than in English, you simply can't go word to word to word. Let me give you an example. My point is that if you want a literal Bible, get a Greek Bible and a Hebrew Bible. There's your literal Bible, right? Okay. If you don't know Greek and Hebrew, then the closest thing you're going to get to it is an interlinear. We're going to talk about this tonight. The closest thing to a literal Bible, word for word in that sense, is an interlinear. But here's John 3:16. Hutos means in this way, for he loved the God, the world, second line, so that the Son, the only he gave, in order that each the believing into him, not he perish, but he has life eternal. Now that's word for word. Is that translation? No, it's not translation. It's replicating words, but it doesn't mean anything. It's not English. It's certainly not stylish English. But even in doing it that way, there's mistakes in there. In this way, for he loved the God. See that old looking symbol, the Omicron, that's got the word the underneath it? You don't say the God. Proper names in Greek are almost always preceded by the article, by ha. Well, you would never translate for in this way the God loved the world. That's not English. So you have to interpret it because of its meaning. We don't say the God loved the world, we say God loved the world. And we capitalize the G, right? Say there's other examples in there. Oh, that's it. But I was just flipping through my interlinear, and I was looking for another illustration. And here's another one. Here's Romans 3:24, the first part, 25. The first word there above justified is a participle. And in this translation, I don't know where I got it from, it comes across as an indicative verb. Say, and are justified, doreon. Doreon, that next Greek word means, I can point. Doreon means as a gift. Well, you don't say justified as a gift by his grace. You don't say justified by his grace as a gift. The Greek order is justified as a gift by his grace. But there was something about English style that suggested to these translators that as a gift should come afterwards. See, they're altering order. Why? Because of English. Through the redemption, here's the interesting one. That's the word the. Well, why didn't I say the? Well, you can't say through the redemption the in Christ Jesus. Well, that's not English. See, the fact of the matter is this article is telling you that this prepositional phrase is modifying this word. In other words, it has no meaning component. It only has a grammar component. Right? For those of you who know the Greek, it's the second attributed position. The redemption. This is what I said earlier. The house, the big. This is one of the two standard ways you have adjectives or modifiers in Greek. And so it's the redemption, the in Christ Jesus. So even in an interlinear, if you want it to make any sense at all, you have to interpret the tense. And you say, that is. Whom God put forward. Well, there's God over there, but English needs a subject before the verb, so I have to change the order around. But here's the really interesting one. Christ Jesus, whom God put forward hilasterion. Whom God put forward propitiation. That's not English. It's called the double accusative in English, in Greek. And the only way to say it's a double accusative, in other words, two direct objects, God put Jesus as a propitiation. You have to add this in. Why? Because Greek has a grammatical structure that English doesn't. So how do you say the same thing in English? Well, you can't go word for word, because you can't say whom he put forward God propitiation. Not English. By his blood, here's the interesting thing. This is the preposition in the of him faith. Oh, I'm sorry, in the of him blood. Oh, that's over there. Through faith. But even this, let's see, they took a preposition through and said it indicates purpose. The purpose is to be received by faith, or the means by which something is received by faith. See what's going on? What I'm trying to get across is you can't go word for word. Even in an interlinear, unless you want it to make absolutely no sense whatsoever. So this is the problem of thinking about a literal translation. The Greek vocabulary, and I'm going to stick with Greek. I know the first 4/5 of the Bible, Hebrew, but I'll let someone else deal with that. The Greek vocabulary, the Greek grammar Greek vocabulary is so fundamentally different from English that you simply can't go word for word, which is what most people mean when they say, I want a literal Bible. But I'm going to take this even further. Mark Strauss is on the committee. He's a professor at Bethel in San Diego, a long friend of mine. And I was watching a presentation he makes. It's on the NIV website, which I can never remember, thenivbible.com, thenivbible.com. And there's a video of Mark doing this kind of presentation. I encourage you to look at it. But he actually does something I've never seen anyone do before. And that is, words don't have literal meanings. When he first said that, I thought, well, that's odd. And he talks about something we call semantic range. Every word has a semantic range. No word has just one meaning, right? It may have a dominant meaning, but I guess I should say almost every word in English as well as Greek has a multiplicity of meanings. I like to talk about a bundle of sticks. Every word has a bundle of sticks. And every stick it refers to a different meaning. And maybe some of the sticks are bigger than other sticks. But every word has a bundle of meanings, a set of sticks. And in Greek, we teach what's called the gloss. When you memorize your vocabulary, you're memorizing one or two glosses. They're the big sticks in the bundle. But that's not to say that there aren't other meanings in that bundle of words. Is the metaphor working? He said, okay. And so, if you were going to produce a literal Bible, how would you get the literal meaning of a word? And what would it be? Mark uses the word key. Give me all the ways the word key is used. This is fun. I did not realize this word's semantic range was so large. The key, the important thing, the key to a problem, let's say. Basketball key, shooting from the key. I'm all keyed up. There, I hadn't thought of that one. The thing that starts your car. A musical key. Keynote. Very good. Mac user. Thank you. The final exam key, a key to the test. A password key. The key on a keyboard. The what? Very good. We got to go to the Florida Keys a while back, and our goal was every single night we ate key lime pie in a different key in Key West. Pardon? Registering key. Oh, well, I wouldn't know about that. See what's going on here? What is the literal meaning of the word key? Doesn't have one. It has a really big bundle of sticks. Words like run. The clock runs, you run a business, you run out of time, you run to the store. I mean, some of these words are just really, really good to use. So if you want a literal translation, that means a word has to have a literal meaning, and it doesn't. One of the things that the NIV was criticized, the 84 edition of the NIV, was its handling of the word sarx. Because one of the sticks in the bundle for sarx is flesh. But the problem is, if you're not raised in a church, if you're not used to Biblish, which is the form of English that people that were raised in old-sounding Bibles speak and understand, it was really hard to convey any meaning at all. And so the 84 committee decided to say, well, there's lots of different meanings of the word sarx, and we're going to choose the stick out of the bundle that fits the context. And people really didn't like it. Actually, one of the votes that we had getting ready for 2011 was to deal with this. And I can see, I'm not on a gag order, but I can't tell you who voted for what. I can remember one Pauline scholar making a plea. Is that okay to say it that way? Making a plea that he said, well, I don't think this is going to go through, but can we revisit sarx? And we did. And we changed a lot of it back to flesh because we thought it worked in a lot more situations than the 84 committee thought. But for example, Jesus says, touch me and see, a ghost does not have sarca and bones, as you see I have. Okay, Jesus saying, okay, there's stuff hanging on my bones here, all right? I'm not a ghost. Okay, that's one use of the word. Colossians 2:1, I want you to know how hard I am contending for you, Paul says, and for those of Laodicea, and for all who have not met me in sarki, in flesh. What does that mean? Personally, right? It's not like, hey, here's Bill Mounce in the flesh. That's not what's going on. It's just an idiom in Greek that means you're actually seeing me. You're seeing my body. You're seeing me. It's in sarki. But where it's really hard is when Paul uses sarx to describe sinful human nature. That's where it gets difficult. And so the 2011 says, the acts of the flesh, sarkos, are obvious: sexual immorality, impurity, and debauchery. The 84 said the acts of the sinful nature are obvious. See what's going on there? The committee at that time thought that flesh just didn't convey enough meaning. And so they wanted to help the reader. And they know that sarx has a wide semantic range, and this definition is a good definition, and it is a good definition of sarx in this context. You pick up any commentary, and it's going to be talking about human sinful nature. It's not going to be talking about what hangs on your bones. But so the question is, what is a literal meaning? Let me stop there before I go on to some other things and just say any questions or comments? Yes, sir.
Do you think the New American Standard Bible will try to be more literal and therefore
More literal. You have 30 minutes to never use that word again. The NASB, which is a very good translation, as long as you don't want stylish English, it's a very good translation. And similar to the ESV, had very strong rules about something called concordance. Concordance says, as much as possible, we're going to use the same English word for the same Greek word. And the good side of that is it allows you to trace an argument through a paragraph. Oh, I see he's using the same word. This is what ties the discussion together. I'm going to give you some illustrations tonight. So if you know that what it's doing, and you know that it's not actually proper English, it's a helpful thing. But it's certainly not an English style that would get passed in a high school term paper class or how to write term papers. So yeah, they were very much word for word try to use the same English word for the same Greek or same Hebrew word. And if they felt like they needed to add a word to kind of make sense, they italicized it. Something that started, I think, in the ASV, the American Standard Version, was the italics, maybe earlier than that. So.
As a translator, is it okay to leave some of the work up to the reader? Because, for instance, as a reader, you know that flesh means sinful nature in some places, and meat and skin in others. That's kind of
Okay, that's a really good point. There's always a point at which you cease being a translator and you start being a commentator. And in the ESV and the NIV, we're incredibly sensitive to where that line is, and we don't want to go over it. The NIV will go closer to it than the ESV will, but we're all super aware that God gave gifts of pastoring and teaching for a reason, and it's not our job to do that. I forgot what I was going to say. I'm sorry, my mind just went blank. The first part of what you said is I wanted to respond to.
leaving some of the work up to the reader.
We always leave something up to the reader. The question is how much. Everybody is going to help the reader. First of all, it's in English. That helps. The most interpretive the ESV ever gets is in 1 John 3. And I remember making the proposals, going into the committee, going, I wonder what's going to happen here. The one born of God does not sin. And I proposed, does not keep on sinning or something. And I thought, oh, this is, that's really right up against that border of helping the reader. And I was shocked. Yep, went right through. Even the one person on the committee that was the most resistant to any change on the RSV, his hand went up right away. Because they were concerned, we were all concerned about people who believe in eradication of the sin nature. And we didn't want to give them a verse in our Bible, our version of the Bible, to support that teaching. That's the furthest toward helping the ESV gets. Now, we would use a word and we say, that's the usual way that word's been translated in the history of Bible translations. But does anybody know what it means? And we'd get out Webster's and would look at it and would say, yeah, that's what it means. Okay, done. So the ESV assumes that you have a dictionary and you'll use it. NIV is not quite that comfortable making you look up words. Okay, thanks.
Did you or anybody do a word search on the concept of literal translation and find out when that phrase entered the English language with respect to biblical studies?
No, but it's pretty easy to do. Google has that, what's it called? Where you can look up words and the history of words and how they're used. We use this thing all the time. I can't remember what it is. Ngrams. Thank you. Yeah, Google has some fantastic ngram technology where you can see the popularity of a word or a phrase for the last 500 years. No, I'm unaware of anyone. But I will look it up. I'm curious now. Okay, let me get back. We're talking about my least favorite word and literal. And let's talk about phrases. Because at the end of the day, when you and I want to convey meaning, we use words, but we primarily use phrases. And there are certain words that belong to other words, and you use them together. And it's only when you look at the words as a phrase that you really get meaning. Now, silliest example I know is German. I was in my doctoral work, and I tried to teach myself German, and I was reading a ton of German, and I never knew if any of it was right. So I said, Mom, Dad, I need some money. I was in Scotland at the time. I said, I got to go to Germany and learn German. So they said, okay. And the people went to a Goethe Institute, and a lot of the students at Goethe at that time were from an American university that knew German a lot better than I did. But they were pretty good. They would force me to ask questions in German. As opposed to the Egyptians who wanted to practice their English as much as their German. So I got constant English from the Egyptians and blank stares from the Americans. Anyway, so it would have been fall, and I was outside with them, and it was cold. And so I said, I'm going to say something in German. And I need to say I'm cold. You know where I'm going, okay. So I is ich, unless you're in northern Germany, it's ish. M is bin, and cold is kalt. Okay, warm is warm, W-A-R-M, but pronounced warm, and cold is kalt. So I mustered up my courage. I don't like being embarrassed, so it's hard for me to do this, but I said, okay, muster up my courage. I'm going to say something in German. I said, ich bin kalt. My friends hit the floor. I mean, they were on the grass. They were laughing, out of control. I went, what is your problem? I say, I bin am kalt, cold. I said, ich bin kalt. And after they kind of I knew I'd done something wrong, and they regained their composure, and I said, well, I know the words that I used, but what did I say? And they said, Bill, you said you're sexually frigid. You have to say something to the effect of, it is to me cold, to say I'm cold. Later on, when the weather got warm, this is in the book, without thinking one day, I said, ich bin warm. I'll let you figure out what that means. But see, we communicate with phrases. We use words, but it's when the words get into the context of the phrase that you start really having meaning. And if you're trying to have a literal Bible, then you have to look at the role of phrases and how phrases convey meaning. And it gets so hard to go word for word when you're looking at a phrase and you know that the phrase has meaning that you're not going to get out of the individual words. Ich bin kalt. Okay? So here's a good example I came across. It's Hebrews 1:3. And Pharaoh the participle upholds. Te is, just we ignore te. Ta panta is all things. To herimatis by the word. Tes dunameos autu of his power. Upholds all things by the word of his power. What's the problem with that? What does it mean? Word of his power? Now, I would understand the power of his word, but the word of his, I have no idea what that means. And when you're doing translation work, even in, actually, certainly as early as second year Greek, sometimes into the end of first year Greek, this is the key that something's going on. I say, just go word for word until it doesn't make sense. And then stop and say, what are other options that would make sense? Well, there's a construction, it's called Hebraic genitive, which you can take dunameos, the noun power, and it turns it into an adjective. Very standard Greek construction, all right? And what it means is, NIV, sustaining all things by his powerful word. Powerful. It doesn't say power, it says word of his power. I saw ESV and ASB and King James translate. Yeah, doesn't mean anything. And isn't that the purpose of translations? To actually mean something. So what you have here is a phrase that if you just translate it literally, word for word, I don't think it means anything. And it clearly means powerful word. So you have this problem of phrases not conveying meaning if you go word for word, if you go literally. But there's also, I sent this article to a couple of my translators, and I got some interesting comments back. And they said, it's actually harder than you said, Bill, because, for example, panta is an adjective. But the only way to make any sense is to translate it as a noun. The all is all things. See, well, I guess the way I did it here, I kept panta as an adjective, but I turned the word the into a noun. That's what I did there. Well, that's not literal. That's not word for word. Here you have, if you know Greek, here's a dative, but we don't have a dative in English, right? We have We have subjective, objective, and possessive, our three cases, right? We don't have a dative case. Well, here's the dative case. So how do you translate it? Well, you have to turn it into a prepositional phrase. So is that literal? Here you have a genitive, roughly corresponding to our possessive case, the of idea. But it's a genitive. It doesn't say of, it's just a genitive phrase. And I had to turn it into a prepositional phrase. So, is it possible to translate phrases literally, word for word, without interpretation? The answer is absolutely no. I mean, this is just, there's thousands of these. Basically, every verse in the New Testament would illustrate this. See the problem? All right. Metaphors. I came across this the other day. The Holman Christian Standard Bible has gone through a revision. It's now, fortunately, they got rid of Holman. Well, they got rid of the name. You shouldn't have a person's name in a Bible. And it's now called the Christian Standard Bible, the CSB. And Tom Schreiner, the professor, New Testament Pauline scholar at Southern, headed up the committee. And they just did a dynamite job at the update. And I've been reading through it, and it is a really good translation. A really good translation. It's sensitive to gender issues, but it will use the word he to refer back to a singular antecedent. But I was reading along, and the way the NASB has Psalm 17:8 is the way I'm used to hearing this verse. Keep me as the apple of the eye. I think another translation is apple of your eye. Hide me in the shadow of your wings. Ooh, you and I are the apple of God's eye. Now that elicits all kinds of meaning, doesn't it? It means he loves us, he cares for us. We're his special children, right? We're the apple of his eye, right? I was reading in the CSB, and they had to change keep to protect. Protect me as the pupil of your eye. That's the pupil of your eye? What's that? Hide me in the shadow of your wings. Pupil? I don't know, for some reason when I read that, I got that picture from the Star Trek movie where Spock and Captain Kirk go to where Scotty is, and that little alien runs up to him, and instead of a pupil, it's just a thing sticking out of his eye moving around. Remember that scene? I don't know, that's just pictures in my mind. Protect me as a pupil. Well, I looked it up. Guess what the Hebrew says? Pupil. Well, what is the pupil of your eye? I've not had a chance to research this, but it's obvious there's no idea of affection. And that's why the CSB says, protect. You're going to protect your eyes, right? And so it's calling on God to protect. But I don't know, maybe in Hebrew this was a term of affection. I don't know. Well, the apple of the eye is NASB, NIV, and other translations looked at pupil of their eye and determined what is, see, we're into metaphors here. That's what makes it so hard. How do you create the same kind of metaphor? How do you, if the psalmist in poetry is going to use a metaphor, you really want to try to use a metaphor. It's really important. It's important not to move the wisdom literature down to prose. And some Bibles do that. There's no poetry at all in some translations of the Psalms. And that's wrong. That's not a translation I would support, because the fact that it is poetry and it uses imagery and metaphors and similes, and even if they're kind of hard to understand, that's part of conveying information, I think. So my assumption is that NASB and NIV looked at that and they interpreted pupil of their eye as an expression of affection. Yeah. So what's the closest metaphor in English? Apple of your eye. And so that's what my assumption is. I'm going to ask him next time I see him, but I guess that's what it is. Metaphors are hard. I think we were talking about it, I guess, up at what's that coffee place called? Clatch. I wonder if Clatch.com is taken. That'd be a good name for a coffee company. Metaphors are hard because so often metaphors sit in our passive vocabulary. Active vocabulary are the words that you use on a regular basis. Passive vocabulary are words that you understand but you don't use. And most of us don't speak metaphorically. I've got a friend, he's a YWAM missionary in South Africa, speaks of their DTSs. And for the life of me, I cannot understand what he's talking about. I mean, I cannot follow him. And his name's Rich. And I finally, a year ago, I said, I think I got it figured out, Rich. You use words to paint a picture, and you let the picture communicate. I use words to communicate. And then doing it, that's exactly right. That's what I do. I use words to create a picture, and then I let the kids see the picture. And I let the picture do the instruction. Again, not my way of communicating, but it is Rich's. But this is why metaphors are so hard, because most of us don't use metaphors. We understand many metaphors, but they're locked up in our passive vocabulary. And metaphors go out of date really quickly. I mean, when I said, life is pain this morning, it's not a metaphor, but I was so thankful that you all laughed. I had no idea whether you knew The Princess Bride or not. But that's 30 years old. But in 50 years, I won't be able to say that because people won't know it any longer. And in 20 years, there'll be metaphors that are understandable now that will not be understandable in the future. And this is just an example of how, if you go word for word, it is pupil of your eye. But the question is, does that mean physical pupil, or is it a metaphor for what we call the apple of your eye? I was doing a conference in Shanghai a couple years ago, and it was on the Sermon on the Mount. So we had 3 days. And there was a point where I was talking about the sermon. I said, Jesus is saying here, you cannot straddle the fence. You got to make up your mind, right? You cannot straddle the fence. And right when I said that, it hit me. I don't remember seeing fences. I mean, most people live in the high rises. They've been brought in from the country, so the country land can be used for farming. I wonder if that made any sense to them at all. So I stopped and I asked my translator, and I said, what did you just say? And she laughed. She go, the Mandarin idiom is a foot in two boat. Now, no, it's not boats. Boat. There's not singular and plural in Mandarin, except for a few pronouns. They use other indicators when things are singular and things are plural. So I said, straddle the fence. She said, a foot in two boat. You know, you can see the imagery, right? And it works. They understood it. But that's the kind of challenges you have in translation with metaphors, and it's why you just can't go word for word. Maybe pupil of your eye. Again, I'm sorry, I didn't have time to look this up, but it's, maybe that's all that it means.
Isn't that the challenge of metaphor? I mean, that my concern would be, metaphor, let's say 2,700, 3,000 years ago.
Right.
You have to understand that.
Right. Metaphors are so tied into culture. They're so tied into culture that it's really hard to get them across. Let me go to one other thing, and then I'm done. But this will illustrate the point that you actually were going to, I think, and that is the issue of idioms. A lot of time when people talk about different translations, they go right to idioms, and I'm not sure that's a good way to do it because no translation thinks that you go word for word in an idiom. But they illustrate the point. An idiom is a phrase where each of the individual words, the meaning of the individual words, do not add up to the meaning of the phrase. Okay, so that's an idiom. And my favorite one is, if you want to say in Hebrew that someone is patient, you say they have a long nose. No, flaring in the nostrils is angry. But patience is long nose. Well, God does not have a protruding proboscis. All right? He doesn't do it's never what the idiom meant to convey, but it comes into the King James as long suffering. So they wanted the long in there somewhere, and so they use long suffering. We don't say long suffering any longer, although it is still in Galatians 5 and the fruits of the Spirit. And hopefully not much longer. Patience, right? I mean, that's what the phrase means. It means God's patient. It means part of the fruits of the work of God's Spirit in our lives is that we develop patience, not that we develop a long nose. But these idioms are really difficult. And this is one of the harder ones. Jesus will reign over Jacob's descendants, eis to sionos. Now, those three Greek words are into the ages. What does that mean? It doesn't mean anything, right? I mean, again, this gets back to something you said earlier. I just remembered it. You said, it makes sense to me. Yes. What about the 10-year-old kid in Bangladesh? You and I, especially since I was raised in the church, I'm guessing you were, that we hear into the ages, and we have enough Christian background that we can kind of figure out that it means forever. But how do you translate into the ages? Because, I mean, the Greek view of history is cyclical, right? Every X number of years, you have the palingenesia, the destruction of all things and the rebirth of the cosmos. Everything that happened before happens over again. This is the Greek view of history. I don't know if you knew that or not, but my dissertation happened to be on rebirth, so I was a little familiar with it. The Jewish view of history is linear, right? That there was a beginning, that, at least for us there was time, there's a Messianic Age, and when the Messiah comes back and brings the kingdom of God, then we go from this age into the next age, the Messianic Age, which among other things is forever, but it has more to do with quality than quantity. That the Messianic Age is a certain kind of time period in history of where there is no sin and where we live in fellowship with one another and we live in fellowship with the Messiah and live in fellowship with God. See, it's more quality than quantity, but that's all tied up in the Jewish view of history. So when Luke is writing this, he says he'll reign over Jacob's descendants in the Messianic Age. How do you translate that? Well, this phrase happens many, many times. And then there's the variation into the ages of ages, which we think is just an emphatic way to say it. And so most translations do something like this. If it's eis to sionos, it's forever. If it's eis to sionos ton ionon, it's forever and ever. I don't know if we really know that, but it was a good way to be consistent in translation, and it keeps an emphasis that probably is there. But there is no way to do that word for word. There's just no way. One of the truths that I have learned since coming on the CBT is that the word literal should never be used in a discussion of translation because it is so readily misunderstood. But if used, it should be used accurately. A literal translation has very little to do with form, if any. A literal translation is one that conveys the meaning of the original text into the receptor language without exaggeration or embellishment. So then the final application question is, so what Bible are you going to read? All Bibles are interpretive. We've seen that, right? I mean, every once in a while I'll talk to someone and say, well, I want a Bible that's not interpretive. Really? You want a genitive phrase or do you want a prepositional phrase? I mean, they're all interpretive. They have to be. The languages are so different. And as different as Greek and English are, Hebrew and English are the east from the west. I mean, good grief. Hebrew just gave me headaches. There's no tense in Hebrew. There's no past, there's no future. How do you communicate when there's no tense? Well, the same way you do in Chinese when there's no number, there's other textual clues as to if something is past, present, or future. But the point is that all translations are interpretive. There's an Italian proverb, which I'm told, well, the Italian proverb in English is all translators are traitors. And I'm told that even that is a traitor to the meaning of the Italian, but I don't know Italian. But the idea is that, I heard you say it. Yeah, Okay. Yeah, I'm not even going to try to say it. But we're all traitors to the original meaning of the text. We simply cannot convey the full meaning of the text. And so the trouble is sometimes you convey a little too much and insert yourself a little too much in the translation process in order to convey meaning, which is, after all, the whole purpose of reading God's word. Or you don't quite get all the meaning. And you shortchange the English reader because there's information in the Greek I just can't get into English. And so that happens all the time. So what you need to do is to find a translation that does the amount of interpretive work that you're comfortable with. But that's why tonight's talk is so important, because we're going to talk about the 5 different groupings of translations and what they're doing, and it'll help you know kind of where you're comfortable. But my encouragement, obviously, is to just don't talk about a literal translation. Literal, the English word literal has to do with meaning, not form. And all translations are heavily interpretive. They have to be. Any other comments or questions? Yes, sir.
This doesn't have a whole lot to this, but known for not knowing really any Greek or Hebrew, what's something that I can learn that you've learned? One of your big mind-blowing things from knowing Greek and Hebrew?
Oh, what are some mind-blowing things I've learned about the Bible by learning Greek? I've been doing this for 45 years, so I don't know if there's many mind-blowing things left. I've been doing this a long time. I will say this, though. I pastored for 6 years, and I made mistakes when I preached. There were Sundays I had to get up and say, hey, I realized I wasn't quite right on something, and so I would correct myself. But when I got up to preach, I had to have the confidence to say, thus saith the Lord. I didn't want to get, well, I think the verse means this, so I think maybe you should apply it this way. I mean, that's not preaching. And what Greek allows me to do is to, and I'm fallible, but with absolute certainty get up and preach, and to not apologize, and to be able to go far enough into the grammar and the vocabulary that I was very, very comfortable with what I was saying. That for me, that's the really big thing.
That, and we have only I'll just say the NIV. What comfort level could we have with that, because we have none of what you have?
Yeah, the NIV, obviously I like it. And the recommendation is everybody pick one Bible, but then always read a second. And don't pick the NIV and the NLT. Don't pick the ESV and the net, because they're basically in the same camps. And what you want is a Bible you're used to, you memorize out of, you underline, you mark up, that verse is in the upper right-hand corner. But it's so helpful to have a different translation and kind of well, that's a different way to look at it. Now, I wrote a whole textbook on this. It's called Greek for the Rest of Us. And so I'm a little biased on this, but when I started writing it's learn enough Greek to use the tools intelligently, Bible Gateway, Accordance, Logos, that kind of stuff. And when I started my research, I expected the Bible translations to differ from each other. And I found out that they rarely do. They rarely contradict each other. The difference is almost always one is vaguer because they're just trying to get the words across, and the other is a little more specific because it's trying to get the meaning across. And that's why you have to choose 2 different ones. So the NIV and the ESV is a fantastic combination. NIV and the CSB is a very good combination. But you want to, there was a time, I was still on the ESV team, and for some reason I was preaching out of the NIV, and I corrected it. And then the next Sunday, Oh, no, the ESV hadn't been published yet. That's what it was. And so I was in the NIV, which I use a lot. And I corrected it, I think, 3 Sundays in a row. And a gal, Kathy, came to me afterwards, clutching her NIV with tears pouring down her eyes, saying, "Do you mean I can't trust my Bible?" She didn't say trust my NIV. She said, "I can't trust my Bible." And that was the last time I ever criticized the translation from the pulpit. Because unless you know Greek and Hebrew and you spent 45 years in it, you have to trust somebody. And the ESV is a very good, a very trustworthy translation. The NIV is a very good, very trustworthy translation. Different kinds of translations. And I think you just have to pick one. And when they differ, the difference will almost always be ambiguity, clarity. But in order to be clear, the translator has to put a little more of himself into the process. So you're going to stop using the word literal? Literally. Yeah, literally. Will you stop using the word literal? It is so confusing to people because it just assumes you can go word for word. And there's not a verse in the Bible where you can go word for word and have it make any sense. I'm sorry? No, I think the Tower of Babel is the third greatest creative act in all reality. The incarnation certainly was the greatest. Christ speaking the world into existence is second. The third is Babel. You understand the caveman did not grunt. There is no evidence of ancient languages being simple. They're all complex. And the process of language evolution is that they simplify. If you know, the oldest language on the face of the earth is the Aborigine language in Australia. It's so complicated, almost nobody can understand it. Chinese is very, very old and difficult to understand. Languages simplify. And the only way to explain thousands of highly complex languages is that God did it. I think Babel is a proof for the existence of God. I just have never read anyone say that. All right. Hey, well, thank you. And tonight starts at 7 o'clock here. Okay, panel discussion. We'll duke it out with the different translations.